All right. Hey, team. I am excited to be bringing to you another screencast here. This one's entitled Intro to Archaeology. Perhaps you've seen the other ones in the past. Those have generally been smaller ones that sort of indicate to you how to use a tool, Schoology specifically for the ones that we've done already. This is going to be a different sort of screencast in which I'm going to deliver you some content, and there's a worksheet that goes along with it. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to bring up that worksheet. You may choose to answer the questions at the end, but at the very least, it's a good strategy to read the questions, have a sense of what I'm asking before we get started. So take a look at that. Excuse me here. There we go. Okay. Going to our review board, we have a simplified map of what haplogroup early human migrations look like based on genetic evidence, which comes from different haplogroups. And we started in this area of Southeast Africa and populated the globe. We're looking at this question of, this is at least a prominent question. I wouldn't quite call it an essential question, but I think an important one, especially for this earlier unit, but for history in general, which is, in what ways is doing history a scientific activity? In what ways is it an artistic one? Up to this point, we've explored ways in which it's scientific, right? We have data that we work with, okay? We know the sea peoples were a group of people who are on the sea. What relationship did they have with the Bronze Age, the collapse of the Bronze Age? Now we're beginning to tease out ways in which doing history is a creative exercise as we sort of assign causes, okay? With genetic evidence, we can see that haplogroup A made it all the way to the Americas, right? We can see the data, the genetic evidence that shows that. Why and how they got there, these are creative questions. And I'm looking at, I'm doing this on Sunday, so before your assignment is due for this, but already I'm getting some really great answers from the few assignments that have been turned in. You're noting that they are moving because there's a lack of resources, possibly food. There's shifts in weather patterns, maybe even climactic changes like smaller or larger ice ages. They're following herds of animals. All great answers. Some of you, rather than looking at sort of those core needs of safety, food, right? You looked at some more human answers, which are also really wonderful answers, such as there was a social conflict of some sort, maybe even escalated into a kind of war or battle. Maybe there wasn't any conflict as much as you had individuals who were curious or adventurous. These are all really, really awesome and appropriate answers for this, and I really like the social answers because, you know, it assigns these early people the humanity that they possess, right? And if we sort of just look at them purely as a lens of trying to find food and shelter, which is certainly something that early humans did and we do today, and at the same time, we just need to be looking at the ways in which they are human. They're curious people, they're adventurous people, and they definitely migrated for those reasons. We can't find evidence for curiosity in the archaeological record, at least as far as I know, and I'm not really sure what that would look like. That is not to say that the early people weren't curious. So anyway, up to this point, just wonderful answers so far, and I thank you. All right. Here are some terms we're going to be looking at, and I think I have you define most of these. Artifact feature, material evidence, carbon dating, YA or BP, a couple acronyms, figure out what those mean and why they're important. Absolute chronology versus relative chronology, middens, and assemblage. I think actually I talk about assemblages before middens. All right, here we go. Artifacts. Okay. You've definitely heard this term. Perhaps it's familiar to you, but these are essentially items that are generally crafted by humans in the past. So you have arrowheads, you have in this picture some ornaments that look like they're probably earrings or something, some sort of decoration, weapons, cooking materials. These sorts of smaller items that can be transported from one place to another that are generally created by humans. These are artifacts. And I say generally created because you can pick up a stone and you need like a hard stone to make these arrow points over here, okay? So that hard stone wasn't necessarily fashioned by the individual that used it. They didn't change it or tweak it necessarily, but it was used as a tool. And in that respect, it's an artifact. Okay. Artifacts exist today. This is a backpack that was discovered on the U.S.-Mexico border. There are no stories associated with this evidence, which leads the archaeologist to, or historian to create stories based on this. There are a number of reasons why a backpack like this may have been left at the border. I think most answers are kind of sad, right? It's kind of hard to come to terms with. This also raises the strength of archaeology, okay? It tells stories. It has a capacity to tell a story from an angle that you might not necessarily get in literature or news, right? TV. Archaeology has a unique ability to tell stories of people who are historically left out of that literary record. I think of, once again, our peasants from Languedoc, 12th century religious deviants. Their story is hard to find. It's hard to discover. That's not to say there isn't a story there. And those stories, I would say, are of immense importance. Immense importance. Okay, features. Features are like artifacts in as much as they have been built and fashioned and made for the most part. Here we have a necropolis, a city of the dead, and you see that there are pits that are dug, there are walls that are, this would have been the ground level actually, so these aren't walls as much as sort of, I guess, interior retaining walls to a larger pit anyway. But you see this is fashion. This is not environment that creates this sort of a pattern. These are human engineered things that can't be transported, like an axe, right? Like a cup, like jewelry. These things are sort of stuck in the physical environment that you do not move. And sometimes it's a thing, like a wall. Sometimes you can't really discover a whole lot except spaces. Like on the necropolis, you see a pit. Oops. On the right side here, you see what are post holes. So there isn't actually, the posts aren't there, but when you investigate the sort of distribution and the pattern of the post holes, you can kind of get a sense of what that physical feature of, in this case, a pit house looked like. All right? So features. A cave, for instance, is a feature. It's not that there's been a whole lot of human engineering for that cave, right? There are geological reasons for the construction of those caves, but since it's in some respects a lived human space, it becomes a feature as well. Okay. Assemblages. I'm going to take you through the value of what an assemblage is, why these are important, how to interpret assemblages. So here we have an unidentified artifact on the left, and just take a look at it. Think about what in the world could this possibly be. And it's tough. It can be so many things. I mean, it looks like a really nasty chicken wing. We know it's not that. But it could be a bunch of things. What if I told you this item here was found in a larger group of things, like among a group of these items? We can identify all these things. This is culinary equipment. These are, that's a fancy word for cooking items, cooking things, right? Cooking accessories. And even though we can't identify that item on the left, since it was found with, in this case, 10 other items that are all cooking, maybe we say, I don't know what that's for, but it's likely for cooking. And this is the concept of the assemblage. The assemblage essentially is a group of items, a group of artifacts that are found together. That's the short definition, a group of artifacts that are found together. In many cases, like this potential one here, you find an artifact that's unidentifiable along with those that are identifiable. And you use the identifiable artifacts in order to create stories or learn about what that unidentified piece is. In this case, actually, the unidentified object was not found with culinary equipment. It was actually found with this item. And that's an ivory flute. And there were a couple other musical instruments as well that it was found with. It turns out that this item on the left operated something as a bell. Okay. Again, it was an unidentified object, not clear what it was, but in concert, oh, that was a pun. I didn't even mean it that time. In concert with the other items, instruments that we find, it leads us toward a greater understanding of what that is. So that's assemblages. A group of artifacts. The value of assemblages, again, is you interpret unknown items based on the larger collection of items that are there. That is Archaeology 101, a strategy used. Which just is a reminder of how important it is to find things in the ground. There are tomb raiders and people find archaeological objects and don't report them. So when you get something that is completely ripped and stripped from the environment in which it was originally, or it was originally left, it's so hard to interpret these and figure out what they are. It's why it's so valuable to find things intact in the ground, so archaeologists can properly interpret them. All right, those are assemblages. Middens, here's another concept. So we look at a midden. A midden is, I guess, a fancy word for an archaeological dump and an ancient landfill, even. In this case, and in many cases, you have shells that are a part of middens. People eat the edible piece and throw away the shell, and there is a special place in which you deposit those items in the ancient world as well. And as time accumulates, you get just a large shell midden or shell trash can. So as you can think, you throw something, you throw other stuff on top of it. So just remembering, if this is a midden, and it is, this one's actually from northern Japan, you got the oldest stuff on the bottom and the most recent stuff on top. All right, and that's a midden. Middens are so important. It tells us, what did people eat? What did people value in some respects as you see things discarded? It tells you what products were available, which ones were eaten. What if there's a product that was available but wasn't eaten at that time? It's really peculiar. It raises questions like, why didn't these people eat this item? So based on what's in the midden and based on what's not in the midden, you just get this brilliant information. Okay, absolute chronology. Now let's look at the difference between absolute chronology and relative chronology. Ultimately, I'm going to make the case that a relative chronology is much, much, much more important. Okay, so let's assign some dates to the shells in this midden. And we figure out these dates based on a process called carbon dating. This is a discovery that demonstrated we can test and see how old an item is by checking its rate of deterioration of carbon. So all living things have carbon in them. When they die, there is a predictable rate of deterioration once they die. So as you, and I won't get too technical on this, I think I have another screencast I can post that takes you through carbon dating in more detail. But essentially, you take a piece of this shell and you can test it for the amount of carbon is left. So based on a few things we know, how much carbon there was, and then how much carbon we're assessing is still in it, we see the rate of deterioration and we can figure out how old something is. This doesn't work with carbon dating, then, as you can imagine, doesn't work with things that are not alive, like stones, right? There actually are different sorts of ways you can test items. In this case, we use carbon dating for things that were alive at one point. So based on a carbon dating, maybe we say that these shells up on top came from 20,000 YA, or years ago. This is a standard conventional designation for things that are super, super old. So anthropologists, archaeologists, and early historians use them a lot. You're probably more familiar with designations BC or BCE, before Christ, or before Common Era, or AD, BCE, which is Ad Domini, from the year of the Lord, or Common Era, CE, right? So you might be more familiar with those designations. These and those sort of have the year zero, right, as the starting points. In this case, we're saying how many years ago did that actually happen? So in that way, I think it's a little bit easier. You don't have to do that math, right? So 4,500 BCE would be about 6,500 years ago, right? All right, so in this case, 20,000 years YA, years ago. And you will also see the convention BP, 20,000 years before present, before right now. They're interchangeable, YA and BP. It's kind of like AD and CE. They're just interchangeable. They mean the same things. Shame to have so much confusion about that. All right, so we date this at 20,000 years YA. We date these at 32,000 years YA. Of course, these are older, right? These are on the bottom. Other ones were thrown on top. So this is what we call absolute chronology. We know that this one is this old. We know that that one is that old. Okay? Absolute chronology. And we do that based on a carbon dating. Okay, let's take a look at relative chronology. So relative chronology acknowledges that, okay, this one's 20,000 and this one's 32,000. But more importantly, what we really need to know is that this one down here is older than the one up there, okay? So when you begin to, say, compare them relatively, you begin to ask questions about process, right? So in looking at changes, what happened between these two? I think a lot of problems in history come from absolute chronologies. For instance, endless debate on if something is 10,000 years old or 3,000 years old. The radiocarbon dating might say 10,000. Another person might say 3,000. And it's not worth, really, in my mind, it's not worth it to engage in those sorts of arguments, because ultimately a historian is interested in process and change. Like, why did the shell trend change, right? Getting sort of entrenched in discussions of how old something actually is really problematic. And also it avoids some other problems in which there are some religious ideologies, some religions that might not account for the earth being that old, right? So trying to engage in a conversation that based on an argument of a date of an object is just not valuable. Relative chronologies allow us to look at process and trends and causes and what happened, hows and whys. And those are the real important parts of history. All right. Archaeologists. Just summing up a little thing here before I get on to our activity, but archaeologists, it's such a brilliant career, really. You get your hands dirty. So there's a good bit of construction. I've had the privilege of being on one archaeological investigation, and it's a lot like construction, all right? You're digging, you're making a mess. It's an organized mess, but you're making a mess. You're using tools. Oftentimes you're generally camping at night. You're kind of roughing it in a lot of respects, which is probably the one thing I really didn't appreciate from being an archaeologist is the camping piece. I am definitely not a camper. I select hotels over camps. I'm not outdoorsy like that, and I realize that's kind of a naughty thing to say in the Pacific Northwest where everyone is campers, but I don't dig it a whole lot. And I'm also not really a great worker with my hands, quite honestly. But there's another aspect of archaeology. Once you get and collect this data, you got to do something with it. You organize it. You write papers. You do presentations. You teach. So there's obviously an intellectual piece that's important as well. And I think this career resonates with people who really like to work with their hands and like to think and speak and write and teach. Furthermore, there's an artistic aspect that's important. These archaeologists have to create maps of sorts of what they investigate and what they find. Oftentimes that means drawings. In some case, they're building models. Maybe it's a physical model, maybe it's a digital model. But there's, again, an important artistic aspect as well. So, archaeologists, and these are three really brilliant archaeologists today. Dr. Susan Alcock being somewhat of a hero for me, being just a great intellectual, brilliant work, wonderful writer, and awesome human. So, make a plug for her. Okay, here we go. These are the midden examples that I have in your worksheet that you're like, I wonder what that means. Well, these are those. And you can read the instructions for the activity, but essentially I have two middens here. This is the first one. Here's the second one. And I have made a little midden. This could very well be a midden that you find with 3 different crustaceans. And you got to figure out what the story is that's being told here. Why was there these shifts over time or these introductions of new shells? What happened? This is the creative aspect of interpreting archaeology. What happened in these? My images. And I'm just going to conclude with this, if you think probably the best screen for you moving forward for the activity. All right, team. I am going to end here, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.